So we'll look at the history of U.S. racial categories in segment 2. And they, just like the story of the Hutus and the Tutsis, have their roots in colonialism. Right? They have their roots. Our racial system in the United States, our system of stratification when it comes to race, has its history in a period of time long before you or I were ever born. So first and foremost, we have to go all the way back to this period of European colonization that was very important for the formation of global stratification, how nations became stratified, is also important in terms of U.S. racial stratification. So during the period of European colonization, we know that European countries kind of moved out and expanded all throughout the world, in part to establish colonies that would help enrich their motherlands. So England and France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and other European nations all had sent people out to establish colonies to be able to get resources to bring back to enrich England, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, etc. And when people were sent out to colonize, the very first thing that they noticed is that they were not the very first people to land in the spaces that they were. So they weren't actually the first people to come to North America or South America or Central America. The European colonizers were not the first people to land in Africa. We're not the first people to land in Australia or China or India, etc. When they got there, they found that there were people living there that oftentimes had entire civilizations. Right? Entire civilizations with their own culture, their own structure, etc. And importantly, the European colonizers wrote reports and biographies and tales and stories that related information about the places that they discovered back to the people of Europe. So if you were living in 1400 or 1500 and you decided to get on a boat and sail across the Atlantic or sail through the Pacific, one thing that you could do once you returned was write a book, or you could keep a journal while you were traveling, and that journal or that book could make you famous. People craved, just as we crave entertainment today, people during this period of time craved the stories of the colonists. What was it like? What were these different groups of people like that you encountered? What did the lands look like? What did the plant life look like? What did the animal life look like? Was it mountainous? Was it a jungle? Was it a desert? So it was really easy for explorers to bring their stories back and have those stories widely distributed throughout the population. People would hear and really want to consume these types of stories. So European explorers' stories were rife with kind of beautiful tales about the different lands that they discovered. And was very important in terms of at least the roots of things like sociology and roots of things like anthropology and other social sciences. This was kind of like the earliest version of it. People writing about what they saw. But different than modern day sociology, different than modern day anthropology, and kind of inherent in the European explorers' writings was a sense of culture shock and a sense of ethnocentrism in their writings. So you can imagine these early explorers going off and seeing entire new cultures, entire new civilizations, and the very first thing they're going to experience is shock. People in these different places live very, very different than I grew up, how I grew up, right, as a European. So first they experience a lot of shock, and then they experience ethnocentrism. these people in these far-off lands live very differently than how I live. But yet, I believe that the way that I live is the best. Right? This sense of ethnocentrism. So the reports and the biographies and the journals of many of the explorers and colonists generally depicted the civilizations and cultures as being inferior to the European culture. Right? Generally inferior to the European culture. So combined with this colonial domination of these lands and depictions of non-European cultures as being inferior, this became kind of part of the truth, right? Part of the actual culture of Europeans. Right? Became thought of or viewed by others as being truthful. That the European cultures were the superior culture and that all other cultures and people were inferior. You know, this cultural ideology soon developed that came out of this, and people represented by the more progressed part of the world, the Europeans, became known as people who were civilized. Right? So Europeans became part of the civilized world and members of civilization. And other cultures and people represented the less progressed parts of the world of savages, or the world of savagery. So Europeans became, through these tales and through this period of colonization, thought of themselves as being civilized in comparison to other cultures which were either part or in totality savage. And in this case, racial and biological traits were linked to the culture as well as the expected behavioral patterns. So civilized people were biologically, morally, psychologically, and behaviorally thought to be superior in comparison to members of the savage world who were thought to be biologically, morally, psychologically, and behaviorally inferior. So you can see how this process of colonization split the world into kind of two distinct groups, one being more important, one being less important. One being inferior, the other being superior. Okay? So, this continues throughout the entire period of colonization, so 1500, 1600, 1700, and continues even through the period of industrialization. So 1800 and 1900, we still think in terms of the civilized world and the savage world. This gets kind of put into lots of different early versions of textbooks, journals, and other types of writings that discuss the world. So early versions of kind of geography textbooks, early versions of psychology textbooks, even early versions of sociology and anthropology textbooks in the 1800s reflects this notion of being two separate groups. One is the superior group, superior in the biological sense, the moral sense, the psychological sense, and the behavioral sense, and other groups being inferior to certain degrees in comparison to that superior group. So here we have in an old textbook comparisons between the European, the Creole Negro, and the chimpanzee, showing or demonstrating that the European is the inferior group, and that the Creole Negro is the inferior group, in comparison to other types of apes, other types of animals. We have another example here on the your right-hand side that just depicts other races aside from the blacks. We see here, in addition, Asians, etc., listed as inferior in comparison to the European superior group at the top left corner here. And then at the bottom in comparison to animals, right? Non-human animals. So, interestingly, this continues throughout the 1800s, and actually one of the most stark or clearest examples is, in fact, in the 20th century. So, 1900, we see civilizations coming together, right? European civilizations coming together to be able to compare or demonstrate which one is the most superior. So there's lots of discussions in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s of what nation is the height of civilization. And you start to see other European and even American countries trying to compete to demonstrate that they are the height of civilization, that their people are the most biologically, morally, psychologically, and physically superior group. One way that this kind of played out was through these really important world's fairs that occurred at the turn of the 20th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century. This one was the 1904 World's Fair. Prior to that was the 1900s World's Fair, or 1898 World's Fair, and that was held in Paris. And Paris did something really, really unique to demonstrate that they were the height of civilization. Does anyone know what Paris, the city of Paris, did to demonstrate at the World's Fair that they were the height of civilization? Go ahead.
Did they put in the Eiffel Tower?
Yeah, they built the Eiffel Tower. It was to show and demonstrate that the French people were so psychologically, morally, and biologically superior that their people could build this giant tower, taller than any other structure in the world, that was mechanical, using the material that was the most advanced material at the time, steel girders, right? So it was this giant steel structure. And it was a way to show that the French people were superior to all other nations of the world. Not just the world of the savages, but the world of even the civilized groups. Well, the United States at this period of time was actually an up-and-comer. They had won their independence, a little more than 100 years ago. We had won our independence. And in addition to that, we had just fought this wonderful, splendid little war, known as the Spanish-American War, in which the United States ultimately beat a nation that was considered to be one of the most civilized, right? We whooped on Spain, right? We really beat up on Spain, who was supposed to have the most superior navy in the world. Right? And a navy is very, very important if you're going to show your superiority. Navy helps with trade. Navy helps keep your colonies supplied and defended. And the United States utterly destroyed the Spanish Armada. And in addition to that, not only did we beat Spain, but we took some of Spain's colonies from them. We took Cuba. We took Puerto Rico, and importantly, we took the Philippines. We took the Philippines. And so when the World's Fair came to the United States, one thing that the U.S. wanted to show is that they could turn the savage nations, right, the savage groups of the Philippines, into at least as close to civilized people as you could get. So part of the World's Fair was to have, in St. Louis, was to have one of the world's largest human zoos. World's largest human zoos. So they sent explorers out throughout the world to gather specimens of human beings from different nations of the world, mostly representing the savage nations of the world. And one of the largest exhibits was the Philippines exhibits. So they got entire tribes and brought them to St. Louis to live for an entire year. One of those tribes was the Igorot tribes. Here's a nice postcard of the Igorot village from the St. Louis World's Fair. And you can see it's a picture of a man dressed in a loincloth, right? not dressed in a suit and tie. The Igorots were a very big attraction at the World's Fair. Every day it was said that around 25,000 people, it's bigger than IUP, all of IUP, would come to watch the Igorots do ceremonial dances and see how Igorots lived. As you move through the Philippines exposition, you move from the more savage tribes to what was considered more civilized tribes. And at the end, you were given a wonderful display of 725 Filipinos dressed in American soldiers' clothes and taught to march and drill just like soldiers. And that was to demonstrate that the United States could take the savage groups of the Philippines and turn them, at least as closely as they possibly could, to the height of civilization, which would be the American soldier. That they were able to drill, march in uniform, take commands, and possibly be able to defeat other civilized nations like Spain, England, etc. Another interesting story that comes out of the St. Louis World's Fair is the story of Oda Benga. The story of Oda Benga. So not only did they have the Philippines exposition in the Human Zoo at the World's Fair, they also had expositions for part of the Human Zoo dedicated to Africa, dedicated to Asia, etc. So Oda Benga was a member of an African pygmy tribe. And he was especially a big draw for the crowds. It said that there was over 20,000 people that would visit Oda Benga's exhibit every day. One of the reasons why Oda Benga was an attractive specimen at the Human Zoo was because his ethnicity, his ethnic group, participated in a beautification ritual in which the men would shave their teeth into points. So you can see here on Oda Benga's picture on the your right-hand side, Oda Benga's smiling with pointed teeth. Some of you in the classroom may kind of cringe a little bit thinking about people shaving their teeth into points as a way to try to make themselves beautiful. But we have to remember to take a step back and think about some of the beauty rituals that we as Americans do today. Right? There's lots of extreme forms of surgery that we participate in, getting breast implants, getting lots done to our teeth, getting facelifts in which the surgical knife is applied to us, even things like getting butt implants and calf implants. So the notion of people modifying their body to demonstrate that they are attractive is just as at home in U.S. culture as it would be at home in the African pygmy tribe of Oda Benga. So Oda Benga was brought to the United States. People loved him. He was a great attraction at the Human Zoo. A year later, after the World's Fair ends, they put Oda Benga back onto a steamship towards Africa. They find that once Oda Benga returns, that his tribe was actually in a large war with a neighboring tribe. And his tribe was completely annihilated. So Oda Benga becomes the last surviving member of his particular tribe. Now, the anthropologist at the time that was with Oda Benga knew that if he left him there alone, that he would surely be killed within a day or so. You can't live without a primary group or secondary group, especially in the African wilderness. So he brings Oda Benga back onto the steamer ship and has this problem. What do I do with Oda Benga? Right? I can't take him back to my place. What am I going to do with this African pygmy? So he makes a few calls and eventually lands on the owner of or the curator of the Bronx Zoo, right? The curator of the Bronx Zoo, who says that Oda Benga can come and live at the zoo and stay on as a permanent display as an African pygmy in the chimpanzee exhibit. So Oda Benga lives for the next several years as a human being living in the chimpanzee exhibit at the Bronx Zoo. And so the picture here on your left-hand side is of an older Oda Benga at the African chimpanzee exhibit in the Bronx Zoo in New York. Eventually, Otabenga becomes a less attractive portion of the exhibit. He gets angry at people teasing him and throwing things at him, picking on him on a daily basis, and eventually becomes more reclusive. And at one point, Otabenga attacks a spectator who was picking on him. So he draws a small knife that he had stolen on a spectator to get him away. And the curator of the Bronx Zoo decides, we need to get rid of Otabenga. So he now has a problem. So Otabenga now kind of gets floated around from place to place and eventually lands in a farm in Virginia, where he works as a tobacco farmer. If any of you are farmers and any of you know anything about tobacco farming, part of the process is to hang up the tobacco leaves on these big, big racks that go up several stories for them to dry. And so Otabenga was hired to work at this tobacco farm because he was able to climb up these racks and get the tobacco leaves off of the drying racks very quickly. He was paid, and as he was paid, he tried to save his money to go back to Africa. But around 1914, war breaks out in Europe, and transatlantic travel completely shuts down. Otabenga, knowing that he won't likely be able to make it back to Africa, goes, lights a ceremonial fire, and shoots himself in the chest. Right? So here we have this great story that relates to this separation of peoples between civilized and savagery. Right? The more civilized nations are considered advanced, and the people in those civilizations are considered biologically, morally, as well as psychologically superior to savage people, who are considered inferior and relating more towards animals, right? Instead of relating towards humans, they relate closer towards our ancestor primates, right? Our ancestor primates. And so, when we think about it, the history of stratification in the United States has this notion that stems all the way back to, the 1500s, the 1400s, even the 1300s. This period of colonization. And our conceptions of who people are and their superiority or their inferiority has its roots in that same process. Now, many of you may wonder, does this actually still have relevance? Right? Do we still today think of people as being biologically, morally, and psychologically superior, while other people are inferior and relating more towards primates, more towards our ancestor primates? And we can look no closer than ourselves. This is a great example that occurred at IUP just this previous semester, right? In which a student, probably unknowingly knowing the history of inferiority and superiority of different racial groups, and their relation to, this long history stemming all the way back to colonization, wrote this kind of insensitive comment about a group of black students on campus, right? And this relates to culture in terms of how sociologists define it. We know that our culture doesn't start from thin air. It begins with the habits of a group of people that get institutionalized and then legitimated and then passed on from generation to generation, oftentimes losing its roots to begin with. So the student, whether or not he or she was aware of what she was saying and the history behind this, still kind of brought up this notion of blacks in the United States relating more towards primates than towards human beings. So with that being said, U.S. History of racial stratification is still present. Right? It's still very much a present thing. And we'll talk more about that whenever we return on Wednesday to discuss dominant and minority groups from the sociological perspective.